this title, but that's all that I was given was this title. And I thought there's a lot of different ways you could go with this. And so we're going to talk about both Psalm 14 and 53 in our lesson this evening. I need to tell you a little bit, though. Maybe you're familiar with the guy on the screen. He's a Christian comedian. He's one of my favorite comedians. He is a guy that we saw, actually, I think John and Carla, y'all were with us the night that we went to see him in concert. There was lack of oxygen, so he actually had to take a break there because he wasn't used to the altitude. But he has several little bits that he does about religion, and one of them he talks about is how that he had just recently discovered that there was an atheist megachurch, which is kind of funny to think about, that there's an atheist megachurch. And then he said, you know, what kind of songs do they sing? And he gave a few examples. And he said, what kind of songs do you think the children sing in their classes? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the songs that he proposed maybe they sang. No one loves the little children, all the children of the world. No one hears you when you cry, no one hears your lullaby. No one loves the little children of the world. This one's even better. Evolution, this I know, for Charles Darwin told me so. Accidentally alive, if you're weak, you won't survive. Well, that's funny to think about. But when you think about the seriousness of what we're talking about this week, about the idea of that there's people in our world, and it's a growing number of people in our world, that don't believe in God, that will make that public proclamation that I don't believe in God. It's really a sad thing. And it's something that ought to really, we talked about in the last hour about having empathy. We ought to have compassion and empathy towards these people and really feel for the situation that they're in. We ought to be in prayer for them, and we ought to use events like this weekend to help arm us to teach them and to reach out to them. You think about what is taught in those Psalms, it paints the picture of what a desperate situation that those who would claim that there is no God is in. The fool has said there is no God. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are duplicate psalms, and they're not alone. There are several psalms that are duplicate psalms. For example, there's a section of Psalm 40 that is is the exact wording of Psalm 70. Psalm 108 is the exact wording of a section of Psalm 60. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are called duplicate psalms, and there's a little bit of difference in them, and we'll talk about those differences in just a moment. But the question always comes up, why are there duplicate psalms? Why are there songs? That's what the psalms are. By the way, it's psalms when you're talking about several, but it's psalm when you're talking about one. You know, I kind of cringe when someone says, turn to Psalms 23. You know, well, there's only one psalm. But anyway, in the book of Psalms, there's duplicate songs in the psalm, just like there is in our psalm books. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, we have songs that have the same lyrics and different melodies. We have songs that have, in the verses, they have the same lyrics, a different melody, and a different chorus. And if you've ever led singing, you know what a frightful thing that is, to start one of those songs with the other song's melody, and it works out for the first verse, and then you get to the chorus, and there's you and about three people going, and everybody else is just looking around dazed and confused, you know. Or if you ask someone to sing the song, would you lead us in As the Deer Pants for the Water? Well, which one do you want? Do you want the old version? Do you want the new version? Or you want the new version? Because we sing 3 at Martin. I don't know if y'all sing 3 here, but different melodies, somewhat different lyrics, maybe a different purpose or message behind the song. Well, it's the same with their psalm book as well. And there are a number of different hypotheses of why there are different, these duplicate psalms in Psalm 14 and 53. There are some that say that in Psalm 14, David is prophesying about Nebuchadnezzar, and in Psalm 53, he's prophesying about Titus. Maybe that's what it is, I don't know. Some say that he's, in fact, a rabbi from the 11th century proposes that in Psalm 14 that David is prophesying about the destruction of Solomon's temple. Psalm 53, he's prophesying the destruction of the second temple. There are some that think that Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are talking about the same occasion, but they're looking at it from different perspectives. Psalm 14 about the deliverance of the righteous, and Psalm 53 about the destroying of the wicked that God will do. And I think maybe that latter one bears a little bit on my interpretation of these two, and we'll get to that and why that is here in just a few moments as we think about Psalm 14 maybe being directed more towards God's people, Psalm 53 directed to those who are outside of God's kingdom. Let me show you the three major differences in Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. First of all, the first major difference is the title itself. You'll notice Psalm 14 is to the choirmaster of David, and we have some additional wording in the title of Psalm 53. Now, we don't know that the titles of these psalms are inspired, but of the oldest manuscripts that we have, they're there, so we assume them to be true. But you'll notice that it says in Psalm 53 that it's according to Mahalath. We're not sure exactly what that is. Most scholars tend to think that this is probably a melody or a tune. So it's kind of the same words, but it's just sung to a different tune, like some of our songs are as well. You'll also notice that it says Psalm 53 is maskil, or it's a didactic. It's a teaching psalm. There's a lesson there for us within that particular psalm. That's the first major difference, is the title. The second major difference in the two psalms, if you're flipping back and forth in your digital Bible or your hard copy Bible, is towards the end. You'll notice a little bit of the text is different in the two. In Psalm 14, it's verses 5 and 6. In Psalm 53, it's just verse 5, but you'll notice verse 5 is extra long. And they start off similarly. They are in great terror, but you'll notice Psalm 53 has added into where there is no terror. For God is with the generation of the righteous. For God scatters the bones of him who encamps against you. You would shame the plans of the poor. You put them to shame. But the Lord is his refuge, for God has rejected them. So there's a little bit difference there. And part of that is what we're going to talk about as we get into the text and kind of the different messages that are within these particular psalms. One of the big differences in Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are the names of God that are used. And by the way, if you go back through the Old Testament especially and you study the different names of God, you find out so much about the characteristics of God, of the nature of God, just by the names that are used to describe God. It's a wonderful and beautiful study. But if you notice in Psalm 14 and 53, in Psalm 53, 7 times God is mentioned, and every time it's God. It is the word, the Hebrew word Elohim, which is kind of a generic word for God. It's a word that means majesty or power or greatness. It is a word that is used when talking about the one true and living God. It's also a word that's used when talking about mighty people or mighty beings. It's used when talking about false gods or idols. But Psalm 14 is different. Psalm 14, 3 times that word is used to describe God, but Psalm 14 also has 4 times when it is Yahweh. Usually in our English translations, that's when you'll see the Lord in all caps to tell you that it's Yahweh. That's the personal name for God. And you understand how that would work, because there are some of you that, because this year you have, I guess it's twice as many speakers as you normally do, some of you will walk up to one of us and you mean well, I'm not making fun of you at all, but you'll walk up and you'll say, you're one of the preachers, right? And I'll say, yeah, and I can see you looking down, where's the name tag at? Where's it hit? You know. But some people you'll walk up and say, hey Gary, hey John. See, there's a difference there in a personal relationship. Y'all have known us for 2 days. You've known each other, for some of you, for a lifetime. Well, it's the same when you think about it from this perspective, that they're using the personal name of God, which is one of the things that leads me to seeing the difference in these 2 Psalms that I do. I really believe that Psalm 53 is talking about the same thing that Psalm 14 is talking about to a certain extent. But Psalm 53 is really geared to talking about those who are not followers of the Lord. And I'll show you some more reasons in just a second for that. Psalm 14 is really giving the same message, but it's giving that message to those who are followers of the Lord. So if you notice, for example, in Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, in verse 3, you've got this very similar phrase, although it's different in our English translations. They've all turned aside, they've all fallen away. Now, the names of God is one of the reasons why I think that there's this difference of righteous and wicked. But this is another one. It's a different translation in our English Bibles because there's a different Hebrew word behind them. The word in Psalm 14 means to change course. The word in Psalm 53 means that they're faithless, that they are in a state of disloyalty. So you think about the idea of, on Psalm 14, he's talking to people that were on the right course, they were on the right path, but something caused them to turn away. Yet these people in Psalm 53 he's referring to are those who were faithless. They weren't followers of God from the beginning. So when we think about this, what we want to focus on this evening is this idea. Not to just pity the fool. We look around at those that are not believing in God, that don't claim a faith in God, and we feel sorry for them, and we feel empathy for them, and we wish that it wasn't that way. But the warning for this evening in our lesson is don't just pity those fools, but don't be the fool. And we'll talk about what that idea of fool means anyway. The fool is not this guy. You know, we think fool and we think the guy that has no sense. The guy that's moronic. The guy that maybe doesn't have very much intelligence, or maybe he doesn't have very much education. When you're looking at the fool in the Bible, particularly in the wisdom books, we're not talking about someone who's uneducated. In fact, the fool of the wisdom literature could be very well educated. The fool of the wisdom literature is not a guy that doesn't have a lot of intelligence. In fact, they can be someone of really high intelligence levels. It's not someone that can't figure things out. In fact, they may be some of the most inventive people around. The fool of the wisdom literature is defined maybe best in the book of Proverbs as someone who really is just refusing to listen to God. He's the person that hates knowledge, the knowledge that comes from God. He's the one that will not listen or be instructed with the wisdom that comes from God. He's the person that doesn't care what he does because he's living for self rather than for the Lord. He's someone who trusts his own heart and his own wisdom, rather than trusting in the wisdom of the Lord. He's someone who has become a follower of his own ideals, who rejects God and lives in moral bankruptcy. Someone who is a disgrace to his community and to his family because of the fact that he's turned away from God. And in the Hebrew culture, that would have been very much something that would have been looked down upon and would have brought great disgrace to a family and to a community. And so when we're talking about the fool, we're talking about someone who is rejecting God, who is rejecting the notion of God, who's rejecting the wisdom of God. And what I want us to do is we're going to go through Psalm 53 and we're going to look at it as atheism from three perspectives. We're going to wind our way down through Psalm 53, and as we do, we're going to notice some of the things that he talks about, these three different perspectives on atheism. And then we're going to go back to Psalm 14 and notice it from the perspective of God's people and how that there's some application that we can make from that. And then we're going to have a New Testament lesson that comes from that over the next couple of hours. That's what we'll try to do. So I'm not sure even what time I'm supposed to be done. I guess I'll get the... All right. Psalm 53, again, is talking about atheism, these three perspectives of atheism as it deals with the wicked. Those people that are not children of God, don't want to be children of God, don't want to follow the Lord, who refuse the Lord. He says from the first perspective here is the fool's perspective in Psalm 53. And so we begin with that opening line. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool, we talked about that one that rejects God, says in his heart, there is no God. Actually, in the original Hebrew language, there is not there. The fool says in his heart, no God. I don't want God in my life. I don't want to have anything to do with God. I don't want there to be anything that in any way associates me with God. I'm rejecting God totally and completely. And that's what so many in the atheistic world has done with the Lord. I want to read you a quote from Christopher Hitchens, rather. Christopher Hitchens said in a letter to someone who was a contrarian to some degree, he says, I'm not even an atheist so much as an anti-theist. I not only maintain that all religions are versions of the same untruth, but I hold that the influence of churches and the effect of religious belief is positively harmful. And he goes on to talk about how that he's not just someone who doesn't believe in God, he's rejecting theism, religion, faith altogether. It's kind of like when we just had a delicious meal served to us by some wonderful young people, prepared by some really godly people, and had great hospitality shown to us. And thank you for all of you that were involved in that meal. But as they came out with the plates, it would be like if they sat down a plate before John and said, would you like some potatoes? And John said, no potatoes. Hold the potatoes, right? Or we're fixing hamburgers. John, would you rather have grilled onions or raw onions? Hold the onions. I don't want any onions. That's what the fool is saying, is hold the God. I don't want any God. I'm not just atheist, I'm anti-theistic. See? And of that person, he's saying it in his heart. That's where that seed of all of the physical, the spiritualness is, the thinking is, the inner being of one. Everything about us, where it comes from. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And that's where this problem begins. And if you think about it, that's really where every spiritual problem that we have is. It's not so much in what we do, it's what kind of hearts that we have. Now, I don't want you to leave here and say, that Sawyers guy, he said that it didn't matter what we do. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying our real problems are at the heart level, not in the action level. Because you can do all the right things, but if your heart's not where it's supposed to be, you're not in a right relationship with the Lord, are you? And on the other hand, if I can get your heart in the right place, then aren't the right actions going to follow? See, it all begins there in the heart. And he says they are corrupt. Here's the perspective of the fool. He says, I'm going to say there's no God, but here's what that ends up causing in his life, is corruptness. It's interesting that if you go back to Psalm 52 and verse 8, the psalmist is talking about his faithful life living for the Lord and how much appreciation he has for the Lord, the life that he's living for the Lord, and he compares himself in living that faithful, godly life to a blossoming, growing, healthy olive tree. And then you get to Psalm 53 and he says, here's the fool, and the root word for fool goes back to a Hebrew word that means withering. Right the opposite of that healthy olive tree. It's withering. There's nothing good about it at all. In fact, this word corrupt is a word that in its most primitive uses talked about spoiled milk. Have you ever smelled spoiled milk? Some of his faces are kind of wrinkling up right now. Here's a better one. Have you ever accidentally poured a glass of milk rather, and you're talking to someone without even paying, you just take a big swig of the spoiled milk? Have you ever done that? Some of you doing like that. That's kind of the reaction I have when I drink buttermilk. I don't like buttermilk. I wish I liked buttermilk, but I don't like buttermilk. Even though buttermilk to me tastes like spoiled milk, you know there's some good things you can do with buttermilk. You can make biscuits with buttermilk. Yeah, and I knew I'd get an amen. I didn't know it'd be about biscuits, but I figured I'd get an amen. You can make cornbread with buttermilk. But there's not one good thing you can do with spoiled milk. You can pour it out to the cat, and the cat will walk over there and go, "Are you serious now? You really?" Not one good thing comes out of spoiled milk. That's what He's saying about their lives. When we reject God, when we reject the principles of God, there's nothing good about that. It is abominable. It's detestable, in other words. These iniquities are missing the mark or are going through this faithless life, not according to a pattern is what the word means. They're not going to live by God's pattern. They're going to live by their own. Now, am I saying that people who are atheists never do anything good? No, I'm not saying that. But guess how they know to do good? It's because of God. Gary pointed that out in the last hour, didn't he? Every good thought that we might have, every good idea that we might have, every good way that we might treat each other, that doesn't come from survival of the fittest, does it? That comes from the Lord God Almighty. That's why you've probably, maybe you have, I don't know, I've never seen, let me put it that way, I've never seen an atheist hospital, have you? Now, I've seen a Catholic hospital and a Presbyterian hospital and a Baptist hospital. I've seen a Church of Christ children's home. I've seen a Church of Christ disaster relief fund, but I've never seen an atheist disaster relief fund. Have you? Now, I'm not saying there's not atheists that don't help with bad things and don't help in hard times, but where did they learn good and evil? Where did they learn that we ought to treat each other this way and not treat each other that way? That doesn't come from survival of the fittest. That can only come from the Lord. Left to our own devices, if we take God completely out of the picture, there is nothing good that comes from that. And that's why He says there's none who does good. On our own, we're not going to do morally good. The second perspective of atheism you see in Psalm 53 is the view of God. He's looking down, he says. Notice in verse 2, God looks down from heaven to see if the children of man, to see if there are any who understand. Is there anyone, God's looking down and saying, is there anybody down there that gets it? That understands and gets it? That realizes what I've done, who I am, everything around you? Because what I'm seeing, God says, is I'm people who aren't really getting it. They're thinking they can come up with a better way, a better plan, a better idea. Is there anyone actually seeking after me? That's really looking for me? What happens, and we've heard different lecturers talk about this throughout this weekend, about how many times that evidence that would disprove atheism, that would disprove evolution, that would prove the Bible, that would prove the creation model, gets swept under the rug. Or we don't want to talk about that. Are we really seeking the truth? Are we seeking God? He says they've all fallen away. We've talked about that. They're in a state of faithlessness. Together, they have become corrupt. There's none who does good. He repeats what he says back up in verse 1. And now he adds to it, no, not one, not even one. And there's a little bit of, this is poetry of course, there's a little bit of poetic exaggeration in that. But from God's perspective, when I'm looking at the totality of humanity, it seems like there's really none who's really seeking after me. We're wanting to use our wisdom rather than God's. We're saying, hold the God. And that's a problem. Then the third perspective on atheism that we see from Psalm 53 is the perspective of the righteous. That is the psalmist. And what he's going to say about this. He says, have those who work evil no knowledge? Don't they really get what's going on here? Haven't they looked around to see the evidence that's there? Instead, what they want to do, he says, is eat up my people as bread. They want to challenge my people. They want to try to destroy and bring down my people. See, we live in a world that says we want everybody to have their own way of life, and you can do what you want to do, and you can say this and you can say that and have the freedom and liberty to do so until you start talking about that dirty 3-letter word. So your mama told you about all the dirty 4-letter words. Don't say those either, okay? But the dirty 3-letter word, G-O-D. Can you talk about that? They don't call upon God. He says, there they are in great terror. All those people that don't believe in God are in great terror. He says where there should be no terror. You think about it, if you don't have God in your life, think about what it means when you get a diagnosis of cancer or some other terminal illness, and how afraid that would make you. If everything in life is about this life and you suddenly find out you're going to die, that's terrifying, isn't it? But as a follower of God, what's the worst that can happen? I get to go be with the Lord. Yes. Right? Or if there's financial ruin in your life. If you're someone who has put all of your treasure here in this earth where moth and rust corrupts and thieves break through and steal, when that's gone, then what am I living for? But if you're putting your treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust corrupts nor thieves break through and steal, that's going to be shown in your lifestyle and you won't face that kind. Or what about death? Either someone you love or even yourself when you're at that point of facing death. That you're terrified of death if you don't have God. But if you're walking with God, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will what? Fear no evil. Why? Because Thou art with me. Thy rod and Thy staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemy. My cup runs over. See, we're not glasses half full or glasses half empty people. People of God are cup running over kind of people. But if I don't have God, what have I got? Terror. And so he says that God scatters the bones of those who encamp. Ultimately, what's going to happen, he says, is there's going to be one of two camps you're in, the followers of the Lord or those who don't follow the Lord. And what a dreadful and fearful thing it is to come under the wrath of a living God when salvation only comes from Him. So if I'm someone who really believes, this is someone outside of the followers of the Lord, I'm someone who says there is no God, then it's nothing but bad that is there for me. Now, that's why we want to make sure that we don't just pity the fool, but we don't be the fool. Can we have some real talk for a minute? Is that okay? We're about halfway done. I don't know if my time's halfway done. It could be 4/5 done. I don't know. But we're about half done with the lesson. So I may have to kick it in a second gear. I don't know. Let me tell you a little story. Gary was talking about the night before last about their chickens. And they had 7 chickens, I think. And he said sometimes they would have 2 eggs and sometimes 7 eggs and whatnot. We used to have 13 chickens. And when we would get to the point that we weren't getting 13 eggs, we would get about 3 or 4 eggs. I would go out there and have a talk with the chickens. And I'd just tell the chickens, look, I'm going to eat. It doesn't matter to me if it's fried eggs or fried chicken. Totally up to you, okay? And my wife would say, Corey, them chickens don't understand you. Every time, next day, guess how many eggs we'd have? It's the only time in my life one sermon's gotten 13 responses. Sometimes you just got to talk plainly, right? Let's talk plainly. You know what the dangers of studies like this are? Maybe the biggest danger of our studying about atheism and evolution. There may be some people in here, a couple that have some doubts. I'm not sure. But I would almost guarantee that 99% at least of the people in this room and the people watching online would say, I believe there's a God. And while these are important studies for us to have, I'm not saying they're not. These are important studies for us to have because they boost our faith. They prepare us to teach our children. They prepare us to go out into the world and be attacked and have the answers for people. But you know what the danger in that is? Is that we study this kind of thing with ourselves and we pat ourselves on the back and say, boy, I'm glad I'm not like them. Are you with me? And maybe even to the point that we look down upon them a little bit. Man, don't you wish they were smart as we are? In Psalm 14, he's talking about atheism from 3 perspectives. But here he's talking to the people that are righteous. The people that are His, in other words. The people that are claiming to be followers of the Lord. The people that are claiming to be His. And every one of us would claim that, I believe in God. Let me ask you a question. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, so don't. If I ask you to raise your hand, do you believe in God? I think probably every hand in this room would go up. If I ask you, do you live like you believe in God? Could I put up my hand? You see, in Psalm 14, if He's talking to the righteous, He's reminding us of these same lessons. From the fool's perspective, don't think about those atheists out in the world. Now we're talking about all of us in this room right here. Sometimes we wouldn't say it with our lips. We wouldn't necessarily say it in any extrovert kind of way. You know, we're going to be here at the church building every time the doors are open because that's how we count faithfulness, right? Here every time the doors are open. We're going to tell people I'm a member of the so-and-so Church of Christ. I believe in God. I believe in Jesus. I was immersed for the remission of my sins. But in our hearts, do we live like there's no God? I say that I believe in God. Do I pray like I believe in God? I say that I believe in God. Do I study like I believe in God? I say that I believe in God. Do I make moral decisions like I believe in God? I say that I believe in God. Do I pick entertainment based on how I believe in God? I say I believe in God. Am I in my marriage and in the way I raise my children honoring God with those decisions? I say that I believe in God, but deep down, I don't want it to show up on Facebook, so I put all the right things on Facebook. Deep down, I don't want you to know it, so I'll put up the good front in front of everyone else. Deep down, I don't want you to know what I really think or what I really desire, but deep down, I know I'm not living like I believe there's a God. And you know what He says about those of us who would say that we believe in God, but in our hearts we live like there's no God. We're just as corrupt. We're just as detestable. Here He uses deeds instead of iniquities. So the things that we're doing, maybe we like to comfort ourselves and say, well, it's not like I'm out here cheating on my wife. I'm not out here addicted to pornography. I'm not addicted to alcohol or drugs. It may not be the sins of commission, but rather the sins of omission. But you know what those sins are? Just as corrupt as spoilt milk. Just as detestable to God. Are we living like we believe there's a God? That second perspective, from God's perspective, He's looking down from heaven and saying, does anybody understand? Because we know the Bible stories. And we can say, yes, I know how Gideon defeated the Midianites. But do we really look at it and say, here's 300 that defeated an entire army, and then we go to our elders and deacons and ministers meetings and say, I don't think we got enough manpower to get that done. Who are we leaving out of the equation? Or we look and say they walked around a wall and the walls of Jericho fell down, and we'll sing the song about it, and then we'll go back to our homes and we'll say, well, I don't know if I can do this or that. Who are we leaving out of the equation? Don't ask me to lead singing or teach a class or preach a sermon. Who will leave it out of the equation? God's looking down and saying, do you, the people that know the stories, do you really know the stories? Do you really get it? Of who I am. And by the way, God doesn't use men to perform miracles anymore, but God's still active and working. He didn't at 100 AD say, well, I'm going on vacation. I'll see you in eternity. Do we really believe that? Are we seeking after Him? There's none that does good, not even one. And then that third perspective, from the righteous perspective, applies to us as well. But it's worded a little bit differently. We're bringing down God's people because when you turn off the right path, guess what? You're going to bring somebody with you. Depending on what position that you hold in the eyes of others, maybe multiple. And a lot of times we'll go through that process maybe because, I've restudied this or I've changed my opinion of this or whatever it might be and do it in the name of the Lord, but are we really honoring the Lord with the decisions that we make? Ultimately, what's going to happen is there's going to be two categories We're going to fit in one or the other. We're going to be those people that build our lives on the Lord and His Word, or we're going to be those people that totally reject Him. And guess what? We're not talking about the atheists. We're talking about some of us. Some of me. The fool. It's not just the person out there that says, I'm anti-theistic. The fool, maybe the greater fool, is the one who knows and still says, hold the God. I want to do my thing for a while. Don't be the fool. Don't pity the fool. Don't be the fool. You think about, I went too quickly there. You think about, if you flip over in your Bibles to Romans chapter 3. In Romans chapter 3, this two Psalms, Psalm 14 and 53, are quoted. Now, Psalms or Isaiah, depending on how you count the references, Psalms or Isaiah are the two most quoted books in the New Testament. But in Romans chapter 3, he quotes, this is right leading up to the passage that Gary ended his lesson with, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And what he does here is he quotes a bunch of different psalms. Before he gets to all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, he quotes a bunch of psalms to remind them, this isn't some new idea that I've come up with. This is what God's been telling us all along. Now let me give you a little background before we get into Romans chapter 3. In Romans chapter 1, he's talking about justification or righteousness. It's the same word. It's the idea of just as if I'd never sinned. It's something that God does and He makes us justified. And then we should spend the rest of our lives on the sanctification process, growing closer to Him. But he starts off in Romans chapter 1 because there's a Jew-Gentile problem in Rome. And he starts in Romans chapter 1 talking to the Gentile. And he says, all of you Gentiles that were out here serving other gods, worshiping other gods, that were idolatry worshipers, that were those who weren't following God at all, didn't claim to follow the one true and living God, didn't have a personal relationship with Him. When you sinned, you were wrong for doing that because you had a law unto yourselves that was put inside you. Then in Romans chapter 2, he talks to the Jew because the whole time he's talking to the Gentiles, the Jews are sitting over and going in the corner, attaboy, Paul, you tell him, Gentiles. And then he says, wait a minute, let me talk to you for a little bit. All of you Jews, you claimed a right relationship with God. You claimed you believe in the one true and living God. You claimed you were following Him, yet all the time, those people in the world were living more morally correct lives than you were. You know what it sounds a whole lot like to me? The contrast we just made in Psalm 14 and 53. And then he gets to Romans chapter 3 and he quotes several Psalms, but if you're reading along in Romans chapter 3, look down to verse 9. He says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we've all charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they've all become worthless. No one does good, not even one. You know what he's saying there? He's saying just like in Psalm 14 and 53, whether you're somebody that totally rejected God or you're someone that with your lips honored Him but your life was far from Him, both of those lifestyles are just as spoilt milk worthless. And it's easy to look over at the Gentile camp in Romans 1 and say, boy, I'm glad I'm not like them. And it's easy for the Gentiles to look over to Romans 2 at the Jew camp and say, boy, I'm glad I'm not like them. And too many times that's what we do between the evolutionists and those who believe in a creation model, is we look at each other and say, I'm glad I'm not like them. But in both cases, if we're rejecting God, it's foolish. It's corrupt. It's wrong, and there's nothing good that comes from it. George Orwell, who was at the very least an agnostic, probably atheistic at some points in his life, talked about how that we push this movement for evolution and it didn't really turn out like we wanted it to. In fact, he talks about how that for years and years we were sitting on the limb that we were sawing on. Now that sounds like a Three Stooges routine, right? You're sitting on the limb and you're sawing on it. And we thought if we could saw that limb off, we'd fall down into this bed of roses. But what we found was that it was barbed wire that we landed on. Here's what he says, though, that I want you to notice. It appears that the amputation of the soul isn't just a simple surgical job like having your appendix out. He says the wound has a tendency to go septic. Here's a guy that says, here's what we really wanted. We wanted to divorce ourselves from God, divorce ourselves from spiritual things, but that wound is a deadly wound. And sometimes, brethren, sometimes I'm guilty of with my lips professing a faith in God, but my heart is far from Him. And if you think about what that means for us, it means that we're in the same situation as the person who would say with his lips, there is no God. Don't just pity the fool. Don't be the fool. When you're making your decisions in your life, make sure God's involved in those decisions. When you pick your entertainment, let God be involved in that decision process. Is this something that I'm professing I believe in God by going to that place, listening to that music, watching that show? Is the way that I treat my wife, that I treat my husband, is that showing that I believe in God? The way that I raise my children and the decisions that we make as a family, is it showing people that I believe in God? When I'm making moral decisions, when I'm making life decisions, when I'm making financial decisions, stop and think about it. Remember the wristbands we had back in the 90s? What would Jesus do? WWJD? That's a good thing to think about, but maybe just think about, am I showing a faith in God by the decisions that I'm making, by the things that I'm doing, by the way that I'm worshiping, by the life that I'm living? And just imagine, if we start living our faith, being what we claim to be, people are going to notice there's a difference. You don't react to things like other people. You don't snap at things like other people. Your posts on Facebook are different than other people. Your marriage is way better than my marriage. Your children and your relationship with it, not perfect, but there's something different going on. That we can go and tell people our faith. We can educate people about Jesus by just explaining what He's meant in our life. What an example we could be. What a light we could be. What salt we could be. And how much could the church grow in Meridian and in Boise and in Idaho and in the United States and in Tennessee and in Cambodia if we just lived the faith we claim? That's what God wants us to do. Yes, there's a need to study apologetics so that we can teach those who don't believe in God. There's a need to study apologetics for us to boost our faith and be sure of what we believe in. But brethren, let's not just profess it with our lips. Let's honor God. Let's show our faith in Him by being people who dream big dreams, by making big plans, by loving with big love, by forgiving others, by sharing Jesus, the Lord that we claim we believe in. If we'll do that, then that's the total opposite of being a fool. It's being a godly and righteous person. Not because we've made ourselves righteous, but because we trust in the only one who can justify and make us righteous. I pity the fool who doesn't realize how serious it is to take these lessons and to apply them to our own lives. May we never be the fool, but rather be the ones that show others our faith in our Lord. Thank you for your attention.